Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Hello again, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this Monday's edition of Alaska Weather. I'm Dave Percy. On the warning, watch, and advisory chart here, we've got wind advisories out now. The warning's been dropped, and now there's advisories out until 10 p.m. Monday evening, this evening, for the passes of the Alaska Range, looking for gusts 60 miles an hour, and that's again out until about 10 p.m., after which the winds will begin to diminish. Satellite imagery showing the front here responsible for those gusty winds across the passes, gradually moving eastward. Some breaks back down along the southwest coast, and a fair amount of rain falling here along the North Gulf Coast, about 1 1/3 inches falling at Seward, a little over an inch at Cordova, while Alyeska picked up just under an inch, about 9/10 of an inch. Those are 12-hour amounts ending early this afternoon. And clouds now on the increase, spreading in across the northern southeast coast, and kind of a wave rolling northward here, and then down to the south, more moisture with this low that's tracking eastward, but beginning to rotate clouds up toward Kodiak, and then a weakening front out here, edging its way in toward the Pribilof Islands. Just a narrow band of precipitation. Wind's not really a factor at all with that feature. And the next system right on its heels, driving eastward there in across the western Bering Sea and the Aleutians. But a lot of south to north flow here, so much milder temperatures all the way out to the Arctic coast than what we saw a day or so ago. On the chart, areas of mixed rain and snow occurring up there. Kind of gusty on the east-northeast winds, that keeping the surface temperatures down in the lower to mid-30s, but freezing levels rising above that. So precipitation mostly in the form of rain or snow, nothing really accumulating in the way of snow at lower elevations. And then down to the south here, of course, rain. We've got this low that's tracked northwestward over the Yukon Delta. Associated front here extending down across south central Alaska, northern Cook Inlet actually, and into the Gulf with good shot of rain, again, over an inch in some areas, as I mentioned, continuing into the afternoon and into the Coast Range as well, with rain, especially on the southern slopes of the Alaska Range, amounting from anywhere from 1/3 to as high as 1/2 inch in some locations. And this rain area edging its way in across Yakutat and also into the northern Panhandle, possibly as far east as Elfin Cove. Otherwise, the southern southeast coast looking pretty good still, and some sunshine there and mild temperatures. Out west, again, that weakening boundary here, not even a front anymore, just a trough with some areas of light precipitation with it, gradually shifting in toward the Pribilofs. A little more extensive precipitation down here over the eastern Aleutians. Next front pushing eastward there with those gusty west-southwest winds. Now it will continue to move east tonight to about the central Aleutians, and starting to bear down on the Pribilof Islands as this trough continues to dissipate, and a weak trough right through here. Keep the showers going across the Kuskokwim Valley, up across the northwest interior, back out across the Yukon Delta. Seward Peninsula, pretty good chance of rain tonight, all the way up just about into the Noatak Valley as that front lifts north. Definitely you'll see a continuous area of rain along the southern slopes of the Brooks Range, starting to dry out a little bit to the south. Still some showers over the White Mountains that'll extend down all the Alaska Range, and periods of lighter rain or showers here will continue along the North Gulf Coast as that front pushes eastward. So rain spreading into the northern Panhandle, but staying dry down to the south. Still a lot of moisture down here to the definitely to the south there, and yet another system rolls northward. So back into the rain, heavy at times, looks like mostly along the central eastern North Gulf Coast, and to a lesser extent over the northern Panhandle. and high pressure keeps it dry and partly to mostly sunny there over the southern areas. This front moves inland, weakens, but a band of rain or showers here from Kodiak Island northwestward to the coast. Otherwise dry to the east. Looks like a dry day coming up for Tanana Valley, northward over much of the north slope. Out west, warm front pushing more light rain into the Pribilofs of the eastern Aleutians, a lot more precipitation and wind out west. Next day, pretty good storm pulls into the Bering Sea here. Gales, possible storm force winds up here developing around St. Lawrence Island ahead of the front, possibly, but pretty good winds and rain pushing eastward rapidly across eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. Otherwise, more calmer conditions over the interior, but mostly cloudy and kind of unsettled. And another system keeps it wet up along the North Gulf Coast. And looking at low temperatures for tonight, mid to upper 20s here for the Brooks Range, not much of a change from last day or so, and down into the lower 30s, which isn't too much lower than what you see up there right now during the daytime highs. So not a lot of change with the clouds and the wind. South a little milder here, lower 40s over the inland valleys, Kuskokwim Valley, all the way out actually to the coastline, lower 40s, as well as the Pribilofs, lower to mid 40s, Alaska Peninsula. And out along the southeast coast, also anywhere from 40 to maybe 50 degrees for the lows, and upper 40s Kodiak Island. Out west, not much change, upper 40s as well. Highs tomorrow, a little bit milder than your lows, about 52 there for Shemya, lower 50s Adak and Atka, but highs forecast in the 40s here for the Pribilofs, Alaska Peninsula, all of the southwest interior. McGrath, Nikolai may reach 50 degrees, but looking at mid-50s for the Tanana Valley area, lower 50s over toward the border, and upper 30s here for the Brooks Range. Again, higher freezing levels now. And out along the Arctic coast, temperatures running 35 to 40 degrees, mildest here on the west side, mid-40s down across Kotzebue, Seward Peninsula to Nome, and even St. Lawrence Island, with near 50-degree temperatures in the northern Panhandle to mid-50s, mid to upper 50s possibly there down to the south. And then for the morning lows for Wednesday, not too bad here, pretty mild over the Panhandle, lows in the 40s. Same thing for south central Alaska and the North Gulf Coast in the 40s. Upper 30s over much of the interior, upper 20s for the Brooks Range, and lower 30s up there along the Arctic coast. Again, mildest in the west, no change out over the Aleutians. High temperatures next day, Wednesday afternoon, mid to upper 30s again, north slope in the Brooks Range, 40s to lower 50s over much of the interior, mostly in the 50s south of the Alaska Range, and the Panhandle about the same, not much change expected.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather, band of IFR here, moving into the central Bering Sea, down just north of the western central Aleutians. Lots of marginal VFR right into the southwest coast and inland here, across southern Alaska, up along the south slopes of the Brooks Range there, including the Koyukuk and Kobuk Valley areas. IFR on the central and eastern Arctic coast. More IFR here coming northward to around the Yakutat area, roughly from right around Yakutat in toward Elfin Cove, with marginal VFR across Prince William Sound and VFR to the southeast. And then for tomorrow afternoon, IFR now, Port Alexander and off the coast, up in and around the Yakutat area with marginal conditions west across Prince William Sound, Kenai Peninsula, eastern slopes of the western Alaska Range, on down to Kodiak Island, and some marginal VFR here along the Brooks Range. IFR mostly off the eastern and central Arctic coast, and then an IFR here, this whole area advancing eastward, and that will be coming into the Pribilofs, eastern Aleutians. Most of the Aleutians tomorrow afternoon will be IFR. And then for Wednesday morning, that area becomes more expansive out here over the southwest Bering to the Aleutians, with a swath of marginal VFR in between this zone of IFR from the Bering Strait across the Yukon Delta to, looks like, across the Kuskokwim Valley to the mountains. And for the areas of Kotzebue Sound and the southern slopes of the western Brooks Range, VFR north in the North Slope, and then an IFR zone here right along the eastern North Gulf Coast and right along the north coast of the Panhandle. And then for Wednesday afternoon, still some lingering IFR there along the central coast, and also over the coastal mountains here, on down to the coastline and northeast Prince William Sound, IFR up here around Denali and the Alaska Range area, and IFR also out here coming eastward now and approaching the southwest coast. Probably won't be until Wednesday evening that makes landfall, but definitely will be socked in there for the eastern Aleutians and also the Brooks Range. Passes Anatuvik VFR becoming marginal, same trend for Adigan. Lake Clark and Merrill IFR becoming marginal VFR for rainy and windy, marginal VFR in the southern approaches. And for Isabel, marginal VFR with Mentasta looking good tomorrow. And for Tanita, marginal VFR possible on the eastern entrance, otherwise VFR. And for Portage, IFR to start with becoming marginal. Chilkoot and White, marginal VFR may become IFR late in the afternoon. Freezing levels, quite a range here, much warmer air now, 2,000 feet back up along the Arctic coast and 10,000 feet over the northern panhandle to 12,000 feet over the southern areas in Dixon Entrance. A little cooler out here over the eastern Bering and along the west coast, 4,000 feet, and then warming up again out over the Aleutians. Icing, a couple of bands here along the southwest coast of Bristol Bay, another one, Pribilofs, on down to the Fox Islands. More coming into the western Aleutians, but way up there at 10,000 feet and above 8,000 feet here for the North Gulf Coast. Could be some widespread moderate rime. Looking at the jet stream, south to north flow here, pulling that moisture right up to the coast, upper level high, and the warm air aloft now centered over the southern southeast coast, ridging up into the Arctic there, and a split in the flow here over the western Bering. And for the 9,000 foot wind flow, low pressure moving up to just southeast of the Kenai Peninsula and ahead of the front there, along and ahead of the front. Pretty good winds right along the coast and off, 45 to 50 knots here, swinging up and turning easterly along the North Gulf Coast and then falling back to 20 to 25, only 15 for Kodiak. Southeast, 20 to 25 here from the western Alaska Range, but diminishing up toward the western Brooks Range. And good southwest winds out here of, 30 to 50 knots out west, and then becoming southerly and lightening up to about 20 knots, 25 knots across the Fox Islands. Much the same pattern, 3,000 feet, 50-knot winds out west, 25 to 30 here across the Fox Islands, and southwest or southeast 20 to 25 there in the west coast areas. And this strong 50 knots here off the coast mostly, 10 knots over the border there, but taking a turn to the east, falling back to 25 knots toward the Kenai Peninsula. And for turbulence, light to isolated moderate chop here, or widespread North Gulf Coast toward Yakutat, also along the Aleutian chain, and a little bumpy up there along the eastern Arctic coast. Well, in a few minutes, I'll be back with a look at the ice edge and the marine forecasts.
Tucked away near Soldovia, Alaska, along beautiful Kachemak Bay, is the Kositsna Bay Laboratory, which is operated in partnership by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the University of Alaska Fairbanks. This unique marine research and teaching laboratory is dedicated to excellence in marine science and provides a place where people can learn more about marine and coastal ecosystems. Here today to talk about the laboratory are its directors, Chris Holderried and David Christie. Why is the location of the laboratory so important?
Jim, Kachemak Bay is a microcosm in many ways of southern Alaskan coastline. It has rocky coastlines, it has glaciers feeding into it, it has eelgrass beds at the head of the bay, and on the north side it has cliffs that are eroding into the bay. So we can, within just a few miles of the lab, we can access all these different types of ecosystems that live with these different environments.
So you have basically a small little world encapsulated in Kachemak Bay.
Provides a natural laboratory.
Yeah. Well, how long has the lab been around?
The lab's actually been around for as long as Alaska's been a state. It
Wow.
was originally constructed in 1959. There was a recognition back then that some of the same problems we face today with sustainable use of coastal resources, there were some challenges then, particularly in the herring fishery, and they saw the need for more science to understand those changes.
So who oversees the laboratory?
Well, the lab is actually run by NOAA through the National Ocean Service, and in the National Ocean Service it's part of our Coastal Ocean Science program. and then we're run in partnership with the University of Alaska Fairbanks. But one of the interesting things is we actually fall under what is called the Center for Coastal Fisheries and Habitat Research, which is another facility located in Beaufort, North Carolina. Some people say, how do you have this connection between coastal Alaska and coastal North Carolina? But if you look at the issues in both places between fishing and ecotourism and sustainable resources, and they're very, very similar. It's a pretty easy connection to make. There is one of our unique features in the lab is that there is a whole range of folks that get to use the laboratory, both from the research side and from supporting our education missions. On the research side, there's researchers from NOAA offices, from other federal agencies, from state agencies, and as well as university scientists. And from an education group, we've got college students, both undergraduate and graduate, and school children that come for field science camps.
That's outstanding. Well, describe some of the research that's being done at the laboratory.
Well, one of our main focus areas of research at the lab is how do we provide the science to sustain coastal resources. Obviously, use of coastal resources is very important in Alaska, and so how can we support that with good science? Some examples are understanding the underwater habitats and how fish and other species are using those habitats, and supporting uses like local mariculture that the oyster farmers are doing.
A lot of the research at the lab focuses around questions about how ecosystems work. How will they change in the future as temperatures potentially change? How will they change with changing amounts of sediment coming into the bay as the glaciers retreat? And in general, why are things where they are and how are they changing through time? And the particular areas that have been focused on recently in the lab are in the kelp forests, which are extensive in the bay, and of course they provide very good habitat for young fish and other animals, other organisms. And then the extensive intertidal zones. We have a 28-foot tidal range in the bay, which means between high and low tide, there's very large areas in which a wide variety of marine organisms live. As we move into the future, we'll be increasingly adding components of instrumentation to the lab, so developing and experimenting with new ways of observing and measuring what's going on underwater when people can't be there.
So what classes are being taught at the lab?
There's quite a range of classes, and it changes every year. The big constant for the last 10 years has been the dive classes. We've trained well over 100 divers in that time. Last year there were 600 scuba dives conducted out of the lab. We have a range of classes taking advantage of the access to the ecosystems of the bay. Classes on vertebrates, classes on invertebrates. We've had a climate change class there last summer, and a variety of things coming up. Some of the classes are taught by UAF professors, some are taught by our partners at University of Alaska Anchorage, and particularly the local Kenai Peninsula Community College in Homer, and also from Alaska Pacific University.
Partnerships. Can you touch on that, Chris? What partnerships have you forged to further the mission of the laboratory?
Yeah, central to how the laboratory operates is that we do most everything we do in partnership with other organizations. We're fairly limited in our federal staff. Right now we just have 2. And so to accomplish all the science missions and the education missions that NOAA wants in this area, we work obviously with the University of Alaska Fairbanks, other universities to do the education mission, as well as local marine education groups like the Center for Alaskan Coastal Studies in Homer. From a research perspective, we do a lot of work with other NOAA offices, so researchers from other NOAA offices, from in the state with the Kachemak Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, which covers most of Kachemak Bay, and with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. That's one of our big partners. And then nationally, we're working with other NOAA offices like the Office of Coast Survey, National Geodetic Survey, and other partners in our coastal ocean science programs.
How do you get the community involved?
Well, that's one of the really fun parts about where the laboratory is and who we get to work with. We do everything from, we have open houses for the general public. We make presentations out in the community. We also get scientists who come into the lab to do research to do presentations on their work, so they get wider exposure to that. We also have a lot of classes that are available for community members to take, as well as doing teacher training workshops and classes that teachers in the local schools, including local villages, can take. And then we do a fair amount of work with the local tribes from Seldovia, Port Graham, and Nenwalek. That's been primarily focused on education programs for the kids.
So what is your vision of the lab?
Jim, we're looking to continue to build the lab in partnership with all the people we work with around the Bay and elsewhere in Alaska to become the place where people choose to come when they have questions, they want to investigate new ways of looking at coastal ecosystems all around southern Alaska. We want the lab in particular to be a place where we can deploy and test new technologies to see how they work in Alaskan conditions before we take them out into the rest of Alaska. And working from there, we're trying to get smarter about how we investigate coastal Alaska, because as you know, there are lots of places where you can't get to very easily, where there are no people. So we need to work out ways of developing instruments that we can put out there when there are no people around. We need to have ways to use the communities, to work with communities, to collect data that are of interest to them, but also that can be fed back to the lab and back to the world in general through the internet.
From a broad perspective, NOAA has an increasing focus on helping communities adapt to climate change. And so the lab is one of the places where we do the science to understand how these systems are changing, how they're changing now in response to climate change, in response to human activities and coastal development, things like that, and then how we can help communities to adapt to those changes in the future.
And thank you for joining us here on Alaska Weather Facts. Until next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back. Looking at today's sea ice analysis. Again, can't see it on the chart here, but new ice again has formed yesterday and lingering into today inside the Barren Islands here along the eastern Arctic coast. And new ice continues to form up here along the main ice edge. It's still well to the north, like 300 nautical miles or so north of Point Barrow. And that trend, of course, will continue here probably for the next 4 or 5 days or longer. And for the coastal forecasts coming up, gales coming in with the next storm here, 35 central coast up to 45 there on the north coast, all out of the southeast, lighter down south, seas building to as high as 16 feet. Southeasterlies at 20 over the inside waters, Clarence Strait and Stevens Passage. Northern Link Canal, south 20, gust 35 knots. Outlook for Wednesday, back down on the winds, 15 knots there, Link Canal and Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait still southeast at 20, and small craft advisories here at 25 knots on the south coast with 12-foot seas, a little stronger up here to the north and more southeasterly at 30 knots with 13-foot seas. For northern Cook Inlet, light winds tomorrow out of the east, 10 knots, 15 knots south of the Forelands. Prince William Sound, mostly north winds at 20, 4-foot seas. East winds 25 knots for the North Gulf Coast there. Eastern part becoming northeast at about 20 for the west side. And then the Barren Islands, we've got east winds at just 15 knots, southeast 20 for Kachemak Bay with 5-foot seas, but again up to 9 and 11-foot seas here, so small craft advisories out for those areas. And then for Wednesday, northern Cook Inlet south at 10, 15 knots south of the Forelands. Light southeast breeze there for Kachemak Bay. Seas coming down to 3 feet, 8-foot seas here for the Barrens, but the winds down to 10 knots. And east 15 for the western North Gulf Coast, southeast to 20 for the east side with 10-foot seas. Prince William Sound, not too bad, east 15, 2-foot seas. Kodiak Island, the east side, pretty light winds tomorrow here, northwest at about 10 with 7-foot seas. Light southwesterlies for Shelikof Strait. Bristol Bay, southwest at 15. West-northwest here across the Alaska Peninsula at 15 knots, 5 to 7-foot seas. And northwest 15 all the way up to Sitkinak. Outlook for Wednesday. Gales come in north side of the Alaska Peninsula up to 40 knots in the afternoon with seas building to 19 feet. Small craft advisories elsewhere here into Bristol Bay at 30 knots, and from Sitkinak all the way to Cape Saratchev, southwest becoming west again 30 knots. Aleutians tomorrow, a pretty uniform wind, southwest 30 knots just about everywhere here, all the way out to Shimia, seas 15 to 17 feet out west, 25 knot winds for the Fox Islands, 7 to 9 foot seas there. Next day, gales, definitely just about, well, all areas here, 40 knots, 35 to 40 knots, eastern Aleutians, and let's see, we've got 40 to 45 knots here in the central Aleutians with good full gales all the way out to Shimia. Seas up over 20 feet here, 23 feet for the central Aleutians, and a little bit higher right through here just west of Nikolsky. Along the southwest coast, westerlies at 15 tomorrow, south 20 for the Pribilofs, and south winds 15, falling back to 10 for St. Lawrence Island. And outlook for Wednesday, southeast 25 here for St. Lawrence Island, and gales along the southwest coast, 40 knots, 40 to 45 knots. Storm warnings out for the Pribilof Islands, southwest 50, seas building to 35 feet, and then southeast 35 minimum gales for the St. Matthew Island zone. Arctic coast, west side here, Wales up to Cape Beaufort, light winds 10 knots, and then small craft advisories here, east 25, pick up to 30 knots on the central coast, and hold that speed all the way over to Demarcation Point. Next day, we've got gales out here for the eastern zone there, up to 35 knots. Seas 10 to 11 feet now on the east side, 9 feet for the central coast, 25 knot winds, 20 knots here on the western coast, Cape Beaufort, down to Wales, south-southeast at 10 with 1 to 3 foot seas. For tonight, again, we've got this system continuing to move northwestward, so starting to become more showery and less showers here over the southwest, the main rain area up across the Seward Peninsula from the Yukon Delta to the Noatak Valley and along the southern slopes of the Brooks Range here with the front itself. Really not much precipitation in this portion of the front at all, but a lot more as you get down toward the North Gulf Coast there with that southerly flow. And then for tomorrow, another system rolls up, more wind and rain. North Gulf Coast heavy at times here, especially over toward Yakutat. This front weakening as it moves inland with a narrow band of rain. And then the next storm out there to the west, warm front right through here, pretty weak, but develops into a pretty good system here on Wednesday with, again, the gale and storm force winds and rain spreading eastward of the Alaska Peninsula.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.